All right, let's jump right in. Welcome, everyone, to our deep dive into some serious JFK assassination research.
Sounds intense.
Oh, it is. We're cracking open issue 3, volume 5 of Kennedy Assassination Chronicles, a magazine, if you don't know, that's like a Bible for JFK researchers.
Yes, Chronicles. A treasure trove.
Exactly. And this issue is special because it came out on the 35th anniversary of, well, you guessed it, the Warren Commission report.
That's a landmark, for sure. So much debate still swirls around it.
Absolutely. And that's what we're diving into today. What's so cool about this magazine is the variety. Articles, news bits, even a letter to the editor, all giving us different angles on the JFK assassination.
It's like a multi-dimensional puzzle, right? Each piece adding to the complexity.
Exactly. So where do we even begin with this?
Well, we could start with this letter from Chris W. Courtwright. He takes issue with the idea that Oswald acted alone, which is, kind of the default conclusion for a lot of folks.
Right, the lone gunman theory. Courtwright reminds us that Oswald was never actually convicted, right?
Precisely. And he points out that serious historians are pretty skeptical about Soviet involvement, too.
So right off the bat, we're questioning the established narrative. Interesting.
It makes you think, doesn't it? And then there's this article about how the Soviets reacted right after the assassination.
Oh, yeah. The telegram from Anastas Mikoyan, a top Soviet official.
That's the one. He suggests that the U.S. government was in a huge hurry to, how do I put this, control the narrative, make it all about Oswald and nothing else.
Bury the truth quickly. To avoid a bigger crisis, maybe?
Possibly. It kind of echoes the worries in that Katzenbach memo, the one urging the administration to pin it all on Oswald ASAP.
Wow. Okay, so right away we've got potential cover-ups, or at least attempts to steer the investigation.
It's certainly suggestive. Whether it's intentional or not, these documents definitely raise doubts about the official story.
No kidding. All right, so we've got some skepticism about Oswald and the Soviets, but then things get really wild when we start talking about disinformation.
Ah, yes, the shadowy world of spies and secrets. This issue has an article about a book, The Sword and the Shield, by Christopher Andrew and Vasily Mitrokhin. It exposes a whole KGB disinformation campaign around JFK's death.
Wait, the KGB was actively trying to mess with the information surrounding the assassination? Why?
Disinformation was a huge part of the Cold War. Both the U.S. and the Soviets used it to undermine each other. Think of it as weaponized propaganda.
So what were they spreading? What kind of disinformation?
Well, get this. They actually forged a letter. It was supposed to be from Oswald to E. Howard Hunt. Hunt was a CIA operative.
Hold on. So the KGB created a fake letter to make it look like the CIA killed JFK. That's insane.
It does sound crazy, right? Like something straight out of a spy movie. But we have to remember the context. Back then, tensions were high and both sides were constantly trying to manipulate each other. And think of the chaos that forged letter could have caused. If it had been taken seriously, it could have pointed the finger at the CIA, potentially destabilizing the U.S. government.
That's insane. So was the letter ever exposed as a fake?
Well, that's where things get tricky. The claim about the forged letter is based on notes from Vasily Mitrokhin, a KGB archivist who defected to the UK.
So we're relying on this one guy's notes. Couldn't he have been wrong, or maybe even lying?
That's a valid point. And some experts even suggest that Mitrokhin himself could have been a CIA plant, feeding disinformation back to the West.
Whoa, hold on, a double agent. Now that's really a spy thriller.
Right. The world of intelligence is incredibly complicated. We have to be cautious about taking anything at face value, especially with something as sensitive as the JFK assassination.
Okay, so how do we know if this Dear Mr. Hunt letter is real or not? If it's based on these potentially unreliable notes, how can we be sure?
Well, handwriting analysis has been done, comparing the letter to known samples of Oswald's writing, but that's not a perfect science. There's always some subjectivity involved. And considering all the talk of KGB forgeries, it's hard to know for sure.
So what's the takeaway from all this? Should we just ignore the letter altogether?
Not necessarily. I think whether it's genuine or not, the letter gives us a glimpse into the methods of intelligence agencies during the Cold War. It shows the lengths they were willing to go to influence events, the kind of shadowy tactics they used.
Makes you wonder what else might be out there, hidden in the archives, waiting to be uncovered. All right, so you've got potential Soviet cover-ups, KGB disinformation campaigns, and a whole lot of questions. What's next?
Well, this issue also commemorates the 35th anniversary of the Warren Commission report. Remember, that's the document that tried to give a definitive explanation of the assassination.
Right. And speaking of the Warren Commission, we have this article by Martin Shackelford titled, Warren Commission Report Turns 35 Years Old. It basically picks apart the report, finding all sorts of omissions, inconsistencies, and questionable conclusions.
Shackelford argues the report is full of holes.
Like, for example, he points out how the report barely mentions how Oswald got into the USSR. It just says he traveled through Finland, but how did he even know to go there? It's like they skipped over a crucial detail.
Yeah, and there are more omissions. The report paints Oswald as a loner, but barely mentions his social life in Russia. And his marriage to Marina is barely touched upon.
It's like they wanted to fit a specific narrative, even if it meant leaving out important information.
Exactly. Shackelford's analysis makes you wonder if the report was carefully crafted to support the lone gunman theory, even if it meant glossing over some inconvenient facts.
And then there's the whole thing about Oswald's wallet.
Oh, right, the wallet. The report claims he left his wallet with $170 in it for Marina that morning.
Turns out it wasn't even his wallet. It was Marina's. They found Oswald's wallet on him later when he was arrested.
These discrepancies, even if they seem small, point to a bigger issue with the report. It feels like they were trying to fit the evidence to their conclusion instead of letting the evidence lead them to the truth.
It's like they had the answer in mind and then picked and chose what evidence to highlight.
It does make you wonder. And this is exactly why we have so many conspiracy theories about the assassination. When the official explanation has so many gaps, people naturally start to look for other answers.
And when the inconsistencies involve something as concrete as a wallet, it's hard not to be skeptical.
Absolutely. It feeds into the suspicion that something's not quite right with the official story.
Okay, so we're seeing a pattern here. The Warren Commission report seems to have some serious problems. But what about the evidence from the assassination itself? What about the photos, the films, the eyewitness accounts? Can't those tell us what happened?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. We have this article by Douglas DeSalles in this issue, and he goes deep into analyzing the visual evidence.
Like a detective piecing together clues, right?
Exactly. He looks at everything. From the Betzner photo, which shows the people JFK was waving to just before the first shot, to Phil Willis's photo, taken right after Willis heard that shot.
Wait, so he's using these photos to try and figure out the timing of the shots.
Exactly. And his analysis suggests that the first shot might have happened earlier than everyone thought.
That's important, right? Because it raises questions about whether Oswald could have fired all the shots from the book depository.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It adds another layer of mystery to the whole thing.
And then, of course, there's the Zapruder film. Probably the most analyzed piece of evidence in the entire case.
Definitely. DeSalles looks at specific frames, focusing on how people reacted, like Rosemary Willis and SSA Hickey. He's trying to get a clearer picture of the sequence of events, the exact timing of each shot.
But isn't it hard to interpret that footage? It's grainy and everything happens so fast.
You're right. And that's what DeSalles points out. He emphasizes how subjective our perception and memory can be, especially in a traumatic situation.
Right. What one person remembers seeing might be completely different from what someone else remembers.
Exactly. And that's why DeSalles' analysis is so fascinating. He tries to reconcile all these different perspectives by comparing them to the film and photos. It's like he's creating a map of memories.
A map of memories. I like that. So is he basically trying to figure out who saw what and when and where they were standing?
Precisely. He uses the film and photos as a sort of anchor, trying to place those subjective experiences within the objective reality of Dealey Plaza.
That's an interesting approach. So what does he conclude? Does he find any definitive answers?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated.
Okay.
Let's take a break here, and then we'll dive into DeSalles' findings and some other fascinating articles from this issue in part 2 of our deep dive. You know, it's amazing how DeSalles really highlights those challenges of trying to piece together what happened in Dealey Plaza. We have all this evidence, but it doesn't always fit neatly together.
Right. It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing, or maybe even from a different puzzle. And DeSalles' work with those eyewitness accounts really shows how tricky it can be.
He's meticulous about it, though. Comparing what they say to the photos in the Zapruder film, trying to pinpoint where everyone was standing, what they could actually see.
Trying to map those memories onto the actual space, right?
Exactly. And what's interesting is that even though they were all there, those eyewitnesses often have different recollections, sometimes totally different.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a crazy, chaotic scene. And it was a long time ago. Memories can get fuzzy.
Absolutely. And that's what DeSalles emphasizes. He points out that even people who were right there in Dealey Plaza might not have a completely accurate memory of what happened. It's fascinating, really.
Like that witness, Jean Hill, right? The one who said she went up to the limo after the shooting.
Yeah, her. DeSalles points out that the photos and the film actually contradict her account. They show her standing much further away from the motorcade.
So maybe she wasn't intentionally lying, but her memory just wasn't reliable.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that we have to be careful about taking those eyewitness accounts as gospel truth, especially in a situation like this with so much trauma and confusion.
It's almost like our minds try to fill in the gaps, right? We want to make sense of what happened, even if it means distorting our own memories.
I think there's definitely something to that. We all want a clear narrative, but sometimes the reality is just messy and unclear.
So how do we sort through it all? How do we get closer to the truth?
Well, that's what D-Cells is trying to do. He emphasizes the importance of looking at the evidence, the photos, the films, the physical layout of Dooley Plaza itself.
Corroborating those stories with the tangible evidence.
Exactly. We can't just rely on someone's memory, especially after so many years.
It's a good lesson for any historical event, right? Don't just take someone's word for it. Look at the evidence yourself.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of evidence, there's another article in this issue that talks about something that could really distort our understanding of history media bias.
Oh, interesting. Which article is that?
It's by Walt Brown. It's called Reflections on the Press and the Kennedy Assassination. He basically looks at how the media covered the assassination and the challenges they faced trying to report on something so big and so sensitive.
Yeah, I can imagine it must have been crazy for those reporters. Trying to figure out what was going on, separating fact from fiction, all while dealing with the enormity of what happened.
It was a chaotic time. Brown points out that in those first few days after the assassination, there was so much conflicting information flying around. Rumors about multiple shooters, about conspiracies, about foreign governments being involved.
Must have been overwhelming for everyone, reporters included.
It was. And Brown argues that in some cases, the media might have actually contributed to the spread of misinformation. Just by trying to get the story out quickly, they might have repeated things that weren't accurate or verified.
So even with the best intentions, the media can end up shaping the narrative in a way that might not be totally true.
Exactly. It's a good reminder to be critical consumers of news, especially when it comes to big events like this. We can't just assume that everything we read or hear is accurate. We have to think for ourselves, do our own research.
Especially today, right? With social media and the 24-hour news cycle, it's easy to get swept up in the hype and not really question what we're being told.
Absolutely. Brown's article is a good reminder to be skeptical, to check our sources, and not just blindly believe everything we see in the headlines.
Okay, so we have to be wary of potential biases, both in eyewitness accounts and in the media. What about the physical evidence? Are there any articles about that?
Yes, actually. There's one by R.A. Martino. It's called The Neutron Activation Analysis Mystery. It's a bit technical, but it basically looks at how scientists analyze the bullet fragments from the assassination.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that. They used a technique called neutron activation analysis to see if those fragments could be linked back to the type of ammo Oswald supposedly used.
Exactly. The Warren Commission used those results to support their claim that all the shots came from Oswald's rifle. But Martino's article suggests that the science behind this analysis might not be as clear-cut as they made it seem.
Really? How so?
Well, he gets into the details of how neutron activation analysis works, and he points out that it has limitations. He says the interpretation of the results isn't always straightforward. He even raises questions about how they handled the bullet fragments, the possibility of contamination, and whether all those fragments even came from the same source.
So the evidence they used to support the single bullet theory might not be as strong as they claimed.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even scientific evidence can be interpreted in different ways, and there's always room for doubt.
It makes you wonder what other evidence might have been misinterpreted or misrepresented over the years.
It does, and it highlights the importance of constantly re-examining the evidence, questioning the assumptions, and being open to new interpretations.
Okay, so we've talked about the limitations of eyewitness accounts, media bias, and even scientific analysis. It seems like every piece of evidence related to the JFK assassination comes with its own set of challenges.
It does, doesn't it? But I think that's what makes it so fascinating. It's like a giant puzzle where the pieces don't always fit and the picture keeps changing as we learn more.
And sometimes those missing pieces, or those pieces that don't seem to fit, are the ones that lead to the most interesting discoveries.
Now you're talking.
Huh?
It's those anomalies, those things that don't quite make sense, that often force us to reevaluate what we think we know.
Like that article by David Lifton, right? The one about the autopsy cover-up.
Ah, yes. The Kennedy autopsy cover-up. Lifton has been a vocal critic of the official autopsy report. He's written books about it.
I remember reading about his work. He's a forensic pathologist, right?
Yes. And he's argued that the autopsy was rushed, incomplete, and maybe even deliberately manipulated to hide something. He points to things like missing photographs, conflicting testimony from the doctors, and the fact that the original autopsy materials were kept under wraps for so long.
So we're talking about the possibility of a cover-up at the highest levels, potentially involving the people who conducted the autopsy itself. That's a serious accusation.
It is. And Lifton presents a lot of evidence to support his claims. He questions the chain of custody of the evidence, the way the body was handled, the whole process, basically. He believes that there are serious questions about the integrity of the autopsy and that those questions deserve answers.
It makes you wonder what they might have been trying to hide, doesn't it?
It does. And it goes beyond just the medical evidence itself. Lifton argues that the lack of transparency surrounding the autopsy fueled a lot of the conspiracy theories and eroded public trust in the official investigation.
Which is understandable, right? If you can't trust the people who conducted the autopsy, how can you trust anything about the investigation?
Exactly. Lifton's work raises some really uncomfortable questions about who was in control, what their motivations were, and whether we've ever gotten the full story.
It's a reminder that sometimes the most important evidence is the evidence that's missing, or the evidence that's been hidden.
Well said. And it's a good reminder to always be skeptical, to question authority, and to keep digging for the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be.
Okay, so we've got potential cover-ups, conflicting evidence, and a whole lot of unanswered questions. It can feel a bit overwhelming trying to make sense of it all.
It can. But I think it's important to remember that the JFK assassination wasn't just about the facts of the case, the bullets and the autopsies. It was also about the man himself, about his legacy, of the impact his death had on the country.
Oh, you're talking about that article by Robert Groden, The Legacy of John F. Kennedy.
Yes, that's the one. It's a nice change of pace from all the forensic analysis and conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Groden takes a step back and looks at the bigger picture.
It's easy to get lost in the details, right? But it's important to remember that JFK was a real person, a president, a husband, a father. His death was a tragedy on a personal level, not just a political event.
Exactly. And Groden does a great job of capturing that. He talks about JFK's accomplishments, his charisma, his vision for the future. He reminds us why so many people were inspired by him.
And why his death was such a shock to the nation, right? It wasn't just a president who died. It was a symbol of hope, of progress, of a brighter future.
Precisely. And Groden also acknowledges the complexities of JFK's legacy. He talks about his flaws, his recklessness, his involvement in some pretty shady stuff. He paints a more nuanced picture of the man.
A more human picture, I'd say. It's a good reminder that even the most iconic figures are ultimately just people with all their strengths and weaknesses.
Well, exactly. And I think that's what makes this whole issue of Chronicles so compelling. It gives us a glimpse into the many layers of the JFK assassination, from the forensic details to the human impact, the political context, and the enduring mystery that surrounds it all.
It's a reminder that history is never simple, that there are always multiple perspectives, and that the truth is often elusive.
Couldn't have said it better myself. But I think we've covered a lot of ground today, wouldn't you say? Maybe it's time we wrap things up for this part and continue our deep dive in the next episode.
Okay, so last time we were talking about how DeSales dives deep into the photographic and eyewitness evidence from Dealey Plaza. He was trying to figure out if the official narrative holds up.
Right. He doesn't just take those accounts at face value. He tries to place them within the context of the photos, the films, the layout of the plaza itself.
So what did he find? Did he come to any conclusions about what happened?
Well, he raises some intriguing points. Like he focuses on a group of witnesses who were on the steps of the Dallas County Courthouse during the shooting. They had a pretty clear view of the motorcade.
So they were in a good position to see what happened. What did they say?
Well, here's the thing. Several of them describe seeing puffs of smoke or debris coming from somewhere other than the book depository window.
Hold on. So they're saying the shots didn't come from where Oswald was supposed to be.
That's what makes their account so interesting. If they're accurate, it throws a big wrench into the whole lone gunman theory. DeSales goes through their statements carefully, comparing them to the photos and the film, trying to see if there's any other explanation.
Like maybe they saw something else, right? A car backfiring or maybe dust from the motorcade?
Exactly. He considers all those possibilities. But he also points out that these weren't just random, isolated observations. Multiple witnesses, independently of each other, describe seeing something coming from a different location.
So it's not just one person misremembering or making things up. There seems to be a pattern there.
Exactly. And DeSales argues that we can't just dismiss that pattern. It needs to be investigated further.
It does make you wonder if there's something more to the story than we've been told, even all these years later.
That's the thing about the JFK assassination. It just keeps drawing you in. There are always more questions, more layers to peel back.
It's a reminder that we might never have all the answers, but that doesn't mean we should stop asking questions.
Exactly. The search for truth is an ongoing process. Now, speaking of truth, this issue of Chronicles also has an article that takes a fresh look at the medical evidence, specifically the autopsy report.
Oh, yeah, the one by Dr. Cyril Wecht. I've heard of him. He's a pretty well-known forensic pathologist.
He is, and he's been very critical of the official autopsy report. In this article, he basically goes point by point, using his expertise to challenge some of the key findings of the Warren Commission.
Like what are some of the things he takes issue with?
Well, for example, he really goes after the single bullet theory, the idea that one bullet went through Kennedy and then hit Connally.
Right, the magic bullet theory. I always thought that was a bit far-fetched.
Well, Dr. Wicht agrees. He says that based on the medical evidence, the bullet would have had to defy the laws of physics to cause all those injuries. He argues that there had to be at least 2 bullets, which means, of course, there had to be a second shooter.
Wow, okay. So he's directly contradicting one of the central pillars of the Warren Commission's conclusion.
He is.
Yeah.
And he doesn't stop there. He also raises questions about how they handled Kennedy's body, the chain of custody of the evidence, the whole process. He says the lack of transparency around the autopsy is a huge red flag.
Which makes sense, right? If they weren't upfront about how they conducted the autopsy, it casts doubt on the entire investigation.
Exactly. Dr. Wett's analysis really makes you question the official narrative. It makes you wonder if there was something they were trying to hide.
It's a bit unsettling, isn't it? To think that even with something as important as a presidential assassination, there might have been a deliberate effort to obscure the truth.
It is. But it also reminds us of the importance of skepticism, of questioning authority, of demanding accountability. And I think that's a valuable lesson no matter what historical event we're talking about.
Absolutely. We can't just blindly accept the official narrative. We have to keep digging, keep asking questions.
Couldn't agree more. And that's what this deep dive has really been about, hasn't it? Exploring those questions, considering different perspectives, and trying to get a little bit closer to the truth.
It's been a fascinating journey, that's for sure. We've covered so much ground: Soviet reactions, KGB disinformation, the Warren Commission report, eyewitness accounts, the medical evidence, the media coverage. It's amazing how much information is packed into this one issue of Chronicles.
It is, and even after all this, there are still so many unanswered questions. But I think that's the thing about the JFK assassination. It's a story that continues to unfold, even decades later.
It's a story that forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge, the fragility of memory, and the complexity of truth.
Well said. And we hope that this deep dive has inspired you to keep exploring those complexities, to keep asking those tough questions, and to never stop searching for answers.
Thanks for joining us.